So first off, I should inform you of a few things. One, this video covers not one book, but two, Incarceron and Sapphique, which is its sequel. Two, there will be massive spoilers in the later part of this video, but I will warn you before I start spouting them. They will not be tiny little spoilers, they will change how you perceive the book, and hopefully how you think about surrealist fiction and fiction in general. There are also a few points I will make later on about surrealist fiction, but that'll be way towards the end. The first book opens with an introduction to Finn, one of the two main characters. Finn lives inside Incarceron, a massive jail. Don't mean it's big like Mall of America or New York City is, I mean it's its own world. At minimum, it's the size of a continent. There are jungles of iron and wolves of wire, seas of mucky black water, and these barren plains of sand and terrible plagues. Incarceron is so massive, it has its own culture, mythos, and even legends, mostly revolving around one man named Sapphique, which I'll get to later. Finn and his friend/gang brother, Kiero, get their hands on a device which lets them communicate with the outside world. Through this, they meet Claudia, who is the daughter to the warden of Incarceron and betrothed to the prince of her nation. She lives in a world where fashion and lifestyles have been artificially set back in the ways of a 1700s European kingdom, even though science is very futuristic, beyond what we have by centuries. Together, they hatch a plot to help Finn and Kiero out of Incarceron, as Claudia believes Finn to be the lost heir to the nation. Throughout Incarceron, we see a common theme arise: entrapment. Catherine Fisher, uses her writing to make us question what really traps us: walls, duties. In Sapphique, a different but just as heavy question emerges: the question of what is real. Okay, from here on out, there will be major spoilers, so if you plan on reading the books, which I highly recommend, leave the room now. You'll miss out on a bunch of the good stuff, but oh well. If you read the book, you constantly hear from Finn, Kiero, and those around him about this man named Sapphique, who is supposedly the only man Incarceron ever loved. This is where Fisher starts to delve into more surrealist fiction and science fiction. Incarceron is sentient. The jail itself creates hurricanes and rearranges hallways on a whim, spreading disease and death as it sees fits, gifting others with treasures and riches. It also creates half-men, which I'll get to later. Sapphique, as jail legend goes, was tormented and then aided by Incarceron in his attempt to escape. Indeed, Finn, the main character, takes many clues and cues from the stories of Sapphique as he escapes, which he does eventually do at the end of the first book. Spoiler. Even Incarceron wants to follow the steps of Sapphique, but before we get to that, which is a very complex issue, let's step back and look at the jail before we get to the surrealist nightmare that is the outside world. The entire function of Incarceron is to guard its prisoners, though it seems to favor a tough love kind of approach to its inhabitants. For this function to be carried out, though, Incarceron needs prisoners. This is where half-men and cellborn come in. The cellborn are recreated by the jail using the dead bodies of former inhabitants, repurposed and reanimated. Sometimes, though, there's not enough viable organic material to recreate an entire person, so Incarceron uses non-organic substitutes. This is where half-men are. Many half-men have whole limbs made of rust and plastic, while others have old pipes in place of intestines or wire for hair. Half-men are treated about as well as the Nazis treated the Jews. Some gangs in Incarceron are wholly dedicated to wiping them out, calling them abominations, while other prisoners just look down on them. We find soon enough that one of the main/secondary characters is actually a half-man, but they hide it very well. It's very well played out. While this is a pretty big deal, it is not by far the biggest plot twist. First, let's look at the outside world. After the years of rage and undescribed cataclysm that was hinted to involve atomic weapons, King Endor, who we hear quotes from throughout the entire thing, he was a bit messed up, decreed that the entire world would be stuck in an 18th century state, so modern weapons would never again develop, which is a pretty solid plan. However, much of the futuristic technology they have, which, as I previously mentioned, is about 100, 200 years ahead of ours, is used to keep up with timeless illusion, and that will be its ultimate downfall, using these illusions everywhere. In this world, no one but the warden of Incarceron knows where the jail is located, which is odd considering it's the size of a small planet. Some blame the Steel Wolves, who are tasked with keeping Incarceron's location safe and, by extent, the warden's family safe. At the end of Incarceron, however, we find the exact location of the prison. Spoiler, it's on the warden's keychain. Using advanced science, Incarceron was shrunk down to about the size of a ping-pong ball, and with it all its inhabitants and electronics. So when we first meet Finn and Kiero, they're about the size of a dust mite, probably smaller. While there is a pseudo-portal that kind of connects the jail to the outside world, they're otherwise completely separate. This plot twist showed that Catherine Fisher can not only write dystopian fiction, which we see in books such as The Hunger Games or the Divergent series, but also surrealist fiction, which is a lot harder to write well, and we don't see it as much in young adult fiction, and I'm really glad that she's bringing it up. What's impressive is that Fisher could trick those who mostly read popular dystopian fiction into reading surreal fiction. No one could account for just how surrealist Fisher would become in Sapphique, unveiling plot twists I've only seen rivaled in works such as Brazil, Dark Science, Dark City, and Metropolis. If these four titles that I just mentioned seem unfamiliar to you, V for Vendetta is also an okay example of the plot twist Fisher displays in Sapphique. One theme we see is that there are two worlds. For Fisher's books is Incarceron and the outside world. For Metropolis, there is the Club of the Suns versus the mechanical labor systems underneath. One of these worlds is always rich and beautiful, while the other is grimy, harsh, and very dangerous. In this genre, crossing between these two worlds always creates massive conflict. Another good parallel between these two works is the henchman trope. This denotes a man who works under a master, such as the Thin Man in Metropolis or Leviathan in Dark Science. In Incarceron and Sapphique, this trope manifests really interestingly. One henchman could be Claudia's father in the first book, as he seems to serve a strange master. However, we find out that he is really just following his own schemes, discounting him. There is Rix in the second book, who is under the influence of Incarceron and causes a lot of problems. However, we find that the henchman in these books is not actually a human character. It's the jail itself. This is due to how Incarceron wants to transcend its current state by escaping in a humanoid body, therefore just using its power as the jail itself to create a new life to complete its master plan. Incarceron has two goals in the second book. One, keeping its prisoners inside, which includes many of our protagonists. And second, Incarceron wants to leave the prison, escape itself really. It wants to follow in the footsteps of Sapphique, the only prisoner, prior to Finn, to escape. Fisher therefore has turned the jail into the jailed, a concept rarely, if ever, seen. Yet still we have not reached the greatest plot twist in the two books, which comes about 70 pages before the end of Sapphique and turns the entire story on its head, giving the protagonist the upper hand again. While trying to stall Incarceron from leaving itself, the jail reveals that it has been working its way into the systems of the outside. We have to acknowledge that Fisher has told us much of the outside world is fake, that there are wands to change facial structure, artificially aged plants, and illusions in places you would expect reality. We then read this as Incarceron proceeds with his plan. But as he turned, he soon stopped dead, and in that second something terrible happened to the world. The bees stopped buzzing, the table dissolved into worm-eaten dust and collapsed. Patches fell off the ceiling. The sun went out. In the chapter after that, we listen to Finn's description of how the outside world is falling apart even more. Horses turned to animatronic piles of rust, the air turned cold, the previously green land barren. The very clothes on his body begin to rot away. When he goes to reason with the queen, who we always saw as a beautiful middle-aged woman, he is greeted by her actual self, who looks about 100 years old. In many stories, we see that illusions are peeled back and the real world is underneath, waiting quietly. In Dark City, for instance, the lair of the strangers lies underneath the city, or how Shell Beach is really just a void beyond the walls. In Sapphique, the world is actually supported by illusions. They are an integral part of almost every single thing in the world, save for the complex machines such as Incarceron itself. We see the true dystopian worlds, one still trying to heal from thermonuclear wars and humanity's corruption. The world itself leaves behind surreal for the real, and we can finally define the central theme of the books. Freedom. Every single goal from every single character, even those who are absent, revolves around freedom. Finn, Kiero, Attia, Sapphique, and Incarceron all want freedom from the jail. Claudia, the warden, and their allies want freedom from the oppressive reign of the queen. King Endor, who instituted the illusions known as Protocol, which created the false world, wanted freedom from the dying world around him. Each character finds their freedom differently as well, but with one key symbol that unites them: the stars. In the two books, seeing the stars are often referenced as the ultimate goal for prisoners who want to escape. However, even the inhabitants of the outside appreciate the stars in the end. The stars themselves mean freedom. The second book ends wonderfully, tying together the want for freedom, the loss of illusions, new trials, and the stars in this passage. And she saw, faint and far, the candle points of flames in the cottages of the poor, the hovels where the prison's wrath and fury had brought no change. Those are stars too, Finn whispered quietly. Fisher shows in this ending that freedom is not what they all thought would be, but it still exists, no matter what the circumstances. In closing, I hope you read these two books, even if I have spoiled most of them for you, because the ride itself is well worth it. Well written and full of surprises, I have no doubt that readers of these books will keep Incarceron and Sapphique in their minds for years to come. I know I have. Thank you for listening.